In 1876, a black family in Kentucky owned more land than most white settlers in their county. They were educated, wealthy, and respected. Then, one autumn night, armed men surrounded their home. What happened next was so horrific that newspapers refused to print the truth. Courts destroyed the records, and for over a century, America pretended this family never existed. Until now. Picture Kentucky in the years after the Civil War. The guns had gone silent, the Union had won, and 4 million enslaved people were suddenly, impossibly free. On paper, at least. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship. The 15th promised the right to vote. But in places like Kentucky, a border state that never seceded and never quite let go of its Confederate sympathies, freedom was more like a dare than a promise. Black codes sprang up overnight, replacing chains with contracts that bound freed people to the same land they'd worked as slaves. The Ku Klux Klan rode through the night, their violence designed to answer a single question. What happens when you give black people rights? The answer, according to white supremacy, had to be terror. But not everyone accepted that answer. In Henderson County, Kentucky, a man named Samuel Foster was writing a different story entirely. Born enslaved in 1838, Samuel had learned to read by candlelight, hiding books beneath floorboards and risking the whip for every stolen word. In 1863, through a combination of saved wages and sheer determination, he purchased his freedom. 2 years later, when emancipation came, he didn't celebrate for long. He got to work. By 1870, Samuel had purchased 40 acres. By 1873, he owned 160. By 1876, he owned 340 acres of prime Kentucky farmland, more than most white families in the county could claim. He grew tobacco, raised livestock, and operated a small mill that ground grain for both black and white farmers. He married Elizabeth, a woman who had taught herself to read using the discarded primers of the white children she'd once served. Together, they raised 3 children: Marcus, 17, sharp-minded, and already attending a black college in Nashville; Sarah, 14, who could recite poetry and solve algebra; and little James, 8 years old, who practiced his letters every night before bed. The Foster family was everything Reconstruction promised. They were proof that black people didn't need white paternalism, didn't need to be controlled or managed or kept in poverty for their own good. They were literate, land-owning, voting citizens, and that made them dangerous, not because they were violent or radical, but because their very existence challenged the lie that white supremacy was built on, that black people were inherently inferior, incapable of self-governance, destined for subservience. Samuel Foster's success was an argument no editorial could refute, no law could suppress. So it had to be destroyed. The signs started small. In 1875, anonymous letters appeared nailed to the Fosters' fence. The language was vile, the message clear: know your place or be reminded of it. Their mill was vandalized twice. Tools went missing. Fences were cut. When Samuel reported these incidents to the sheriff, the man barely looked up from his desk. There were no investigations, no arrests, just a shrug and a suggestion that maybe Samuel was imagining things. White merchants, who had once done business with the family, suddenly refused their money. The local Democratic newspaper began running editorials about the dangers of uppity coloreds who forgot their station. They never named the Fosters directly. They didn't have to. Everyone knew. At the Black Baptist church the family attended, which doubled as a school and a community meeting house, the pastor spoke in careful code. Success, he reminded his congregation, made them visible, and visibility made them vulnerable. But Samuel couldn't stay quiet. This was 1876, an election year, and the stakes had never been higher. Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden were locked in one of the most contested presidential races in American history, and in Kentucky, the battle lines were stark. White Democrats were using every tool at their disposal to suppress the black Republican vote. Intimidation, poll taxes, outright violence. Samuel Foster had organized voter registration drives. He had testified to federal marshals about the intimidation tactics. He had become a symbol, a rallying point for black political participation in Henderson County. And symbols, in that time and place, were marked for elimination. The conspiracy didn't form in shadow. It formed in plain sight, in the back rooms of the courthouse and the private clubs where the county's most powerful men gathered. The sheriff was there. So was the county judge. So were the largest landowners, the newspaper editor, the men who controlled credit and commerce and law. They weren't random vigilantes. They were the establishment. And they had a problem. Samuel Foster. Not just him, really, but what he represented. His prosperity threatened the racial order they depended on. His political organizing threatened their grip on power. His refusal to defer, to bow, to play the role of grateful freedmen that threatened their sense of who they were. So they made a plan. They would wait until after the election, when the federal troops stationed in Kentucky as part of Reconstruction enforcement would be at their most distracted. They would make an example so brutal, so complete, that no other black family in the county would dare to dream that big again. November 8, 1876. Election night had come and gone. Rutherford B. Hayes would eventually win in a corrupt compromise that would end Reconstruction and abandon black Americans to a century of Jim Crow terror. But none of that was clear yet. In the Foster home, the family was settling in for the night. Elizabeth had just tucked James into bed, his primer still open on the nightstand where he'd been practicing his letters. Marcus was home from college for the election, talking politics with his father in the front room. Sarah was already asleep. The house was quiet. Outside, in the darkness, 30 to 40 armed men were gathering. They didn't wear hoods. They didn't need to. They knew no one would stop them. They knew the sheriff was one of them. They knew the courts would protect them. They knew history would forget. The first shot shattered the front window just before midnight. Samuel grabbed his rifle, the one possession the 14th Amendment theoretically protected his right to own, and rushed his family toward the root cellar. But there were too many men, too many guns, and they had surrounded the house. Someone shouted to set it on fire. Within minutes, flames were climbing the walls. The Foster family faced an impossible choice: burn alive inside or run into the gunfire outside. Samuel made the decision. He would hold the doorway. Elizabeth would take Sarah and James and run for the woods. Maybe in the chaos and darkness, they could escape. Marcus refused to leave his father. At 17, he'd spent his whole life watching Samuel build something from nothing, watching him stand tall when the world demanded he bow. He wasn't going to run now. Father and son stood in that doorway together, firing into the mob, trying to buy Elizabeth and the children a few more seconds. The men outside returned fire without hesitation. Samuel Foster fell first, then Marcus. Both cut down in the home they had built, on the land they had earned. Behind them, the house burned. Ahead of them, the mob reloaded. In the woods, Elizabeth ran, clutching Sarah with one hand and James with the other, their bare feet bleeding on the frozen ground, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them. They ran until they couldn't hear it anymore. They ran until dawn. When the sun rose on November 9th, a crowd had gathered at what was left of the Foster home. The house was ash and charred timber. 2 bodies lay in the yard, uncovered, displayed. People came to look. Not to mourn. To look. To see what happened to black people who forgot their place. Someone took photographs. Those photographs would later disappear, along with so much else. The sheriff arrived mid-morning, surveyed the scene with the casual authority of a man inspecting routine business, and made his official report. The mob had acted in self-defense against a Negro insurrectionist. No arrests would be made. The case was closed before it ever opened. Within 48 hours, the local newspaper ran its story. Negro insurrectionists put down. The headline read. The article described Samuel Foster as a dangerous radical who had been plotting an armed uprising. His literacy was evidence of seditious intent. His property was proof of ill-gotten gains. His voter registration work was reframed as political insurgency. The story spread. Democratic newspapers across the South picked it up, each version more embellished than the last. By the time Northern papers mentioned it at all, it was a footnote, just another disturbance in the post-war South, barely worth a paragraph. The narrative was set. Samuel Foster was not a victim. He was a threat who had been neutralized. Elizabeth tried to fight back. Hiding in Cincinnati with her surviving children using a different name, she still tried. She gathered what documents she had, the land deeds and tax receipts that proved the family's legitimacy. She traveled back to Henderson County and attempted to file charges. The county clerk laughed in her face. When she insisted on seeing the judge, the same judge who had helped plan the attack, he dismissed her testimony as unreliable. She was a woman. She was colored. Her word meant nothing. The Foster land was seized for unpaid taxes, despite Elizabeth's receipts proving otherwise. It was divided among the men who had killed her husband and son. The mill was dismantled. The church school was burned. Within 6 months, every trace of the Foster family's existence had been systematically erased. And then came the final betrayal. In 1877, as part of the compromise that gave Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction was officially over. The few investigators who had cared about cases like the Fosters were reassigned or dismissed. The fragile infrastructure of justice that had existed, imperfect as it was, collapsed overnight. Court records went missing. Newspaper archives were selectively damaged. Witnesses were threatened into silence. The Foster massacre joined thousands of others in a mass grave of forgotten history. For more than a century, it was as if Samuel, Elizabeth, Marcus, Sarah, and James Foster had never existed at all. But here's what those history books didn't tell you. The Foster family wasn't an isolated case. Between 1865 and 1876, Black Americans in the South accumulated an estimated $20 million in property, the equivalent of $500 million today. They created 4,000 schools. They elected officials to local, state, and federal government. They built thriving businesses, vibrant communities, a future that looked nothing like slavery. And then came the counter-revolution, the Colfax Massacre in 1873, where 150 black people were murdered. The Vicksburg Massacre in 1875, where 300 died. Dozens of smaller atrocities, each one designed to answer the same question white supremacy kept asking. What happens when you give black people freedom? The answer was always fire and blood and erasure. The Foster Massacre was part of a coordinated campaign to destroy black economic independence. It wasn't random violence. It was policy, enforced by mobs and legitimized by courts and newspapers. The prosperity black families built in those brief Reconstruction years was systematically stolen, and the theft was covered up so thoroughly that most Americans have no idea it ever happened. We talk about the wealth gap today as if it's some mysterious force of nature, but it's not. It's inheritance. The inheritance of land seized, businesses burned, families destroyed. The self-made white fortunes of the early 20th century, many of them were built on stolen black property. This isn't ancient history. This is the foundation our economy stands on. In 2015, something remarkable happened. A historian digging through a forgotten box at the Kentucky Historical Society found a journal. It belonged to a white woman whose husband had been part of the mob that killed the Fosters. Her entries from November 1876 were written in a shaking hand, filled with shame and horror and fear. She described the attack in detail. She named names, every one of them a pillar of Henderson County society. And she wrote something that cuts right to the heart of it all. They say they did it to protect us. I think they did it because they couldn't stand to see a colored man succeed where they had failed. That journal had been hidden for 139 years. Someone in that woman's family knew it was too dangerous to destroy, but too damning to reveal. So they buried it, and it stayed buried until long after everyone involved was dead. But the Foster story didn't end in that burned house. Elizabeth, Sarah, and James survived. They made it to Cincinnati, changed their last name, and disappeared into the great migration of black refugees fleeing Southern terror. Elizabeth worked as a washerwoman until she died in 1904. She never spoke publicly about what happened. Sarah became a teacher in the segregated schools, quietly excellent, quietly defiant. James became a minister and a secret keeper. He told his children the story, and they told theirs, a whispered history passed down through generations. In 1998, his great-great-granddaughter, Dr. Patricia Foster Williams, a historian with a Ph.D. and a bone-deep certainty that her family's story mattered, began investigating. She found land deeds in county archives that had somehow survived. She found bills of sale. She found letters. Piece by piece, she reconstructed proof that her family had existed, had prospered, had been erased, and had mattered. And here's the part that should make your blood boil. Those 340 acres the Foster family owned? Today, it's a golf course and a luxury subdivision. The property is worth approximately $12 million. Not a single historical marker mentioned what happened there until 2019, when Dr. Foster Williams fought for 5 years to get a plaque installed. It reads, "In memory of the Foster family, whose prosperity was punished and whose story was silenced." The current property owners fought the plaque. They said it would hurt their property values. Think about that. The land is worth millions because it was stolen, and acknowledging the theft might lower the price. In 2023, Dr. Foster Williams filed a lawsuit for reparations on behalf of her family. She's not just asking for money. She's demanding that America remember. The case is ongoing. The golf course owners are fighting it. The state of Kentucky claims too much time has passed, that the statute of limitations protects them from the consequences of a massacre. But Dr. Foster Williams has a different view of time. They took 139 years to hide the truth, she said in a recent interview. I'll take as long as I need to uncover it. The Foster family isn't unique. They're representative. For every story we know, Tulsa's Black Wall Street, Rosewood, the Wilmington coup, there are hundreds we don't. Hundreds of families erased, hundreds of communities destroyed. The pattern is always the same. Succeed, get targeted, get destroyed, get erased, get blamed. This happened to black inventors whose patents were stolen. It happened to black towns that were burned. It happened to black businesses that were bombed. The system didn't just steal their present. It stole their past, so that future generations wouldn't know what had been taken, wouldn't know what was owed. History isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember. The Foster family built a legacy of black excellence in the immediate aftermath of slavery. America's response was to burn it down and bury the ashes. But their great-great-great-granddaughter dug it back up. And now you know their names: Samuel, Elizabeth, Marcus, Sarah, James. They were here, they mattered, and they won't be erased again. This is one story. There are thousands more.